Good morning, everyone. Hope you're doing well right now. Can anyone name an exact moment their life changed? Anyone? You can raise your hand if you want to. Well, most of the people think that they can. Maybe it was the day they moved to a new country, switched schools, or made a life-changing decision. And for sure, those moments feel big, defining, and important. But what if I told you that the real turning points aren't the ones we really remember? What if the biggest changes in our lives have been happening silently, somewhere in the background, without us even noticing them? Think about something you're really struggling with right now. I can start. Right now, I'm really struggling with submitting my assignments before the due date, which kind of plays around with my stress levels. But for some of you or others, it can be adjusting to a new environment, pushing yourself through a challenge, or just figuring out what to do next in your life. And most of the time, it probably feels like nothing has truly changed except your stress levels, as mentioned, and of course, sleep schedule. But what you might not realize is that at the same time, your brain is actually doing something incredible. And by incredible, I mean it's adapting, meaning it's rewiring itself, creating new connections, strengthening the old ones, and even letting go of the ones that are no longer useful. And I know that sounds pretty obvious, right? Of course, our brains change. Of course, all of us learn and grow. But just think about what that really means. Every single thing you go through, every struggle, every new experience, and every thought we repeat to ourselves, all of it is still with us. Not just as some kind of memory that will slowly fade away, but as a physical change inside of every single one of our brains. And most of the time, we don't even notice that that change is happening. Instead, we tell to ourselves that we're stuck, that we're not changing, that nothing around us is changing, and that we're not improving. However, deep inside, underneath all of that self-doubt and uncertainty, our brains are quietly reshaping themselves, making sure that none of us are the same person we were yesterday. For some reason, we think of change as something external, like new stylish clothes or brand new car. Basically, something we choose, something we see rather than feel. Yet the real transformation is happening inside of our brains every single second of every day. And this is due to neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to physically reshape itself in response to new experiences, learning, and our everyday thoughts. Okay, so now I'm about to sound quite nerdy for a second here. I know science talk can feel a little dry and pretty unbearable for some of you here, but trust me, this part will give you a much better understanding of how our brains actually work. So, inside of our brains, there are around 86 billion neurons, or in other words, tiny nerve cells that create connections by passing electrical and chemical signals, leading to around 100 trillion connections. So every time you learn something new or experience something challenging, these neurons fire together, meaning they activate at the same time in order to send signals between their connections. The most interesting thing, though, is that the more often a certain thought or action is happening, the stronger and more resilient these connections become. Kind of like your everyday route to school or work. The more often you take that one exact pathway or a certain turn, the clearer and more intuitive it becomes for you to drive, such as not needing to use Google Maps anymore. This is called Hebb's rule. Neurons that fire together wire together, or in other words, every time you repeat a skill or habit, or just think about a certain thought, your brain is physically making that pattern and connection more permanent than ever. Nevertheless, neuroplasticity isn't just about strengthening your neural connections. It's also about letting go of the ones that we don't use anymore. In science, this is known as synaptic pruning, where the brain basically removes weaker connections in order to create a room for much stronger and useful ones. This also explains why when learning something new, it might feel quite awkward and frustrating at first. However, if you remain patient about your new skill or passion, your neural connections will eventually become stronger. On the other hand, this is also the reason why it feels impossible to break bad habits. And I'm not just talking about alcohol or smoking, I'm also including things such as procrastinating, lying, gossiping, and even talking more than listening. This is because your brain has spent years reinforcing these things, literally carving them deep into your behavior. Another, and finally the last thing I really want to mention, is that this isn't something that happens to you when you're still a kid or in your early adulthood. For some reason, in the past, scientists used to believe that after a certain age, or around 25, our brains actually stop developing and maturing, kind of like becoming fixed. However, according to neuroscientist Michael Merzenich, the brain is capable of significant change throughout its entire life, which he demonstrated in his studies, showing that adult brains can reorganize their structure and function. So, in fact, our brains never stop changing, meaning that neuroplasticity happens throughout our entire life. This also explains why when being put in a new environment, we can pick up new skills or adjust to new ways of thinking, why blind people can develop much stronger hearing, why musicians' brains are wired differently than non-musicians, and why people who meditate can rewire themselves to feel calmer and more focused. So yeah, if you ever feel like you're stuck and it's impossible for you to change, I promise you, it's not. None of us are fixed, and none of us are permanent. And our turning points aren't a single dramatic event. And it's definitely not something we can predict or circle in our calendar. It's happening right now, in all of those tiny moments we don't really think about. However, those exact unnoticed moments are the ones that shape your story. Thank you.